Good morning. My name is Michelle Lavelle Henry, and I am a member of the Westminster Social Justice Ministry team. We build the social justice forums around a common theme, and this program year, our theme is diving deeper together so we all will flourish, belonging to the beloved community. The theme builds on our heightened awareness of systemic and critical issues affecting our community, brought to the greater attention in recent years. The forums will be learning about long-standing needs and becoming more prepared to support the flourishing of all members of our community and all belonging together. Today, we welcome Anna Kendig Flores. She is a teaching elder and a board-certified chaplain with specialties in mental health, addiction, and organizational ethics and equity. Anna brings these perspectives to her anti-racism efforts, incorporating spiritual practices with a holistic approach to anti-racism living that seeks to build wholeness in communities from the inside out. She currently serves as the anti-racism coordinator for the Presbytery of the Greater Twin Cities area and serves in other venues, including a co-moderator of the General Assembly Committees on Representation. In Sabbath times, she can be found pursuing her favorite spiritual practices of mountain biking and permaculture gardening. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you. It's so good to be with you all this morning. And this is just a wonderful opportunity to kind of talk about that spiritual practice piece that I mentioned in the bio, which is, for me, spiritual practice is this broad and open territory where we can talk about a lot of different things as being spiritual practices. So today, I wanted to actually think about three practices or three attitudes, three perspectives that we can bring to times of change. And so what I have is a presentation called Ships Built for Sea Change, Navigating the Work of Justice in Tide Shifting Times. And I think that when I say those words, we probably all sort of understand what they mean from the inside, right? We know what tide shifting times feel like because we've been living through them. Maybe not just in the last 6 months or the last 2 years, but maybe it's gone farther back than that for us, farther back than that for our communities. And so, we just have to think about what it means to be in the midst of a sea change, a moment when, as a society, as communities, as the world, we are going through things that are transforming us. And the question is how do we want to be transformed? So when we think about all the collective suffering that we are going through, how do we want to let that be a teacher about how we want to be different in the future? And so in the midst of all this, the reason I brought this particular topic today is because what I'm seeing in the last 3 months even is a moment where people who had a lot of stamina, a lot of goodwill, a lot of hope, a lot of desire for justice in their communities are getting tired. And maybe they've been tired for 6 months before that, or a year before that, or 3 years before that, but our stamina is running dry. And so recognizing that somehow it feels like with the next push, it doesn't quite push through. What does it mean to live in times like these? And so that is what we're here to talk a little bit about today. And I come with this topic as one that's very active in my life because I think that all of us have this feels important to us, but I want us to think together a little bit about it. So as we start talking together, I guess my question is why seas and ships? We're here on dry land, we're in Minnesota. Right? There is a good ship-faring tradition up in Duluth by Lake Superior, but other than that, we are not seafarers in this area for the most part. But some of this idea came from some bits and pieces that I've been listening to over time, and one of them was an interview with a woman who's a big wave surfer in Ireland. And one of the things she talked about her conviction that she is taught spiritual truths by learning how to ride the big waves out in the cold seas of Ireland. That she has to learn how to trust herself, that she has to learn how to trust the water in ways that she would never have had to do if she just stayed safe on dry land. And her other conviction is that this is where we are meant to be, that the water is where we are meant to be, not just safe and stable all the time, but in motion and moving and going with the flow. So all that to say, I think we're made for seafaring. And at this moment, that actually might feel like good news when we feel like we're being tossed and turned by the waves. So all of that to say, I don't have 10 tips for doing social justice work in the midst of being tossed by the waves. But I do have 3 ideas that I think we can talk about together and think about ways that they could be parts of the dialogue in our communities. So I guess my first question is this: what do these 4 images have in common? This is a hillside, by the way. So they're tiny little dots up on the far right, and those dots are humans. The white things in the back are tents, or the white dots on top. Again, this is an overhead shot. Any guesses? You do not have to have the right answer for this one because it's a bit obscure. But are there any guesses? Paths. That's really interesting to notice that. I heard somebody else say something. Places of worship. Actually, that's a really good point too. Yes. So there are some paths and like ways through these different arenas. And yes, some of these were sacred spaces. And the thing that I saw in common in these 4 images is that each of these spaces took generations to build and to maintain. So what we have here is this is the Uffington Chalk Horse in Great Britain, and this is 3,000 years old. And it would have disappeared in a couple generations if it hadn't been maintained over the course of 3,000 years by the community. Canterbury Cathedral. This is the incredible effigy mounds area down in southern Minnesota, sacred site for indigenous groups in this area for thousands of years, for burial, among other things, and ritual. And these are the chinampas in Xochimilco in Mexico. These are gardens built on a lake. They are eco spaces. And so in each of these, I think it's worth recognizing that even though we have this sort of like very standard image of like what it looks like to build something grand, each of these are grand. They are powerful, and they are testaments to the way that humans decide what is valuable and choose to maintain it. And so I think my point there is that this is the common theme, having generational vision. And I don't mean generational vision in terms of building empires that can never tumble. I don't mean generational vision in terms of claiming land and then defending it against everyone else. I mean generational vision in terms of imagination that allows the community to decide to maintain something so beautiful as this chalk horse, even in the midst of times of war, because it was that valuable. Focus that helps generations of workers and craftspeople build a space that's going to become a community center, among other things. Clarity to maintain values amidst life and death and burial from generation to generation in a community. And vision that over 1,000 years ago turned what was just water, which is life-giving, into a garden that could be life-giving for even more people. So this sort of generational vision is something that it may sort of sound like something we talk about a lot, which is generational thinking, like what am I going to give to the generations that come after me? But this is how we normally talk about this. We talk about it in terms of wealth transfer or being remembered or putting our facts and names out into the world, right? Like building our genealogies Now, to be fair, I love building a genealogy, so there's nothing necessarily wrong with any of these things, but I want to notice that this is a little bit more narrow and individually focused than what I was showing you in the previous images, right? So there's nothing necessarily bad about these, but they do tend to just benefit people that I know, or benefit me, or benefit, the people who have their names recorded in writing somewhere. And so, to be honest, even though some of these are, sometimes even just neutral, sometimes they can work against what we're actually talking about here. And so this first theme is generational vision, because it's not about hoarding or just kind of keeping something for myself or my loved ones. It seeks the common good. It's not set in stone, even though, yes, there was a cathedral in there, right? But it's iterative. And by that, I mean it tries a lot of things and it's willing to learn and not rest on permanence or perfection. And I think the examples of that speak most to me are the examples that are more rooted in the earth, that Uffington chalk horse, the chinampas in Mexico that grow fruit and food and beauty every year. And then it's not just about knowing or certainty, but about exploring. So learning, curiosity, and attentiveness to new needs. So when we think about this idea of living with generational vision in times of sea change, it's important to just recognize that this attitude helps us think broadly beyond ourselves and helps us think broadly in time. And those can both be very powerful when it's easy to get stuck in the next hour or the next day or the next minute or the suffering that I'm feeling, instead of thinking about how am I connected through that suffering to so many other people. So in this way, I just thought that this would be one powerful practice that I am still trying to embody and think about how to do. It will be a lifelong process. But I think this one actually leads into the next practice that I think could be really powerful, which is radically interdependent action. And, it's one of those things where it seems like that's very nice, but isn't that just another word for cooperation, right? It seems like more words to say the same thing. But actually, radically interdependent action is more like a vow. It's more like an affirmation of a fundamental truth than something you can opt into. Cooperation, I can choose to cooperate or not cooperate. I can choose to opt in or opt out. But when I choose radically interdependent action, I'm just choosing what's already true anyway, which is that we're all connected. And we're connected to all of creation, to all living beings, and to all matter here on this earth. So that might seem like a big idea, but I thought it would be easy to just start with 3 places where I see it actually happening. What does radically interdependent action look like? Well, let's see some examples. So here's one that I just recently learned about and I love. This is an organization, Mycelium Youth Network, that's out of Oakland, and they are a youth sort of educational and environmental eco-justice community development space in that area. And so they work mostly with young people, but when they try to develop something new, they don't just sit around in a room as a group of experts on youth. They go to the young people and they say, what do you need? What if we did something like this, what should that look like? What would inspire you? What do you need from us? And that is how they take their lead. And I think even in that, there's a tremendous lesson for us, right? Not because young people inherently have more wisdom, but because they have wisdom that needs to be at the table, just like every generation does. So the second piece that I love about this one is they are equipping young people to have spiritually grounded practices and pragmatic tools for survival and change making in a world where the environment around them will change in their lifetimes. The temperature may change, the vulnerability to certain types of flooding or fires or other things may change. So what will it look like to live in their community, to care about their people in that context? So one way they did that is this Gaming for Justice, and so this is Dungeons and Dragons, but in the style of environmental, yeah, thank you. We got one fan over here. Dungeons and Dragons, which is a super expansive and flexible multiplayer game that a lot of adults and young people really enjoy. They're using that platform to think about futures together. So they're daring to dream big. Another place is the Decolonizing Wealth Project, which I think is a really exciting way of thinking about how sort of philanthropy, in quotation marks, can change and become more relational. So you can see there are three main words: connecting, relating, and belonging, disrupting the existing systems of moving and controlling capital. So a lot of their work is around returning wealth and reframing how we think about wealth and community beyond power, clout, and capital. So again, interdependence, right? Wealth cannot be mine. Wealth has to be ours. And letting go of control, which is hard for most of us, and leaning into trust. So finally, the third one is Satya Yoga Co-op. And one of the things that they're doing that I think is really interesting is that they believe in welcome, which sounds very simple and basic, and we all say, yes, I believe in welcome too. But their point is that you cannot be welcoming unless you choose to welcome the most marginalized first and make the space safe for them. You cannot truly be welcoming unless you're intentionally focused on the first benefit being to marginalized communities and people. That's the way you build welcome from the ground up. And I think that's really powerful because often we tend to frame welcome around everyone is welcome the same. And they say, no, actually, we have to start by prioritizing and privileging those who are most often sort of sacrificed for the welcome of others, for the safety of, for the comfort of others, for the emotional sort of well-being of others. And so it's a space that is really focusing on equity, not equality. But that takes work, and it means that some people will get upset. And so this radical interdependence is a lot more than just playing nice in the sandbox. So you can see here that there are some ways that we often talk about something that sounds like radical interdependence, but that isn't quite it. So it's not just playing nice. It's not just sharing from the excess that we have, especially when we think, okay, I'm already okay, now I can give. It doesn't believe that experts come in only one form, and it doesn't lean into these pieces around money being influence, or those with more free time being those who end up with more power. So again, sometimes cooperation in these forms may not necessarily always be a harmful thing. People with more free time can add very powerful things to our community spaces. People who have income, people who can cooperate by playing nice, that's not necessarily bad, but it's gonna eventually work against the things that we really wanna move toward and need to move toward as a community, which is this interdependent action. So you can see here some of the contrasts that I put up, and one of them is that it's not nice, but it's powerfully compassionate. And so when I say powerfully compassionate, I don't just mean that we feel everyone's feelings all the time. It means that I try to live with and suffer with, especially the most afflicted. So being mindful of those pieces around power. The second piece is it's not just charitable, but it is courageously communal. And that is hard because we start thinking about all the things that we might have to give up. But we don't think about always the things that we would gain by truly believing that we needed one another to survive. And finally, not just sharing the process or sharing decision making, but deferring to the most marginalized, the most affected by the choices that are going to get made. And really thinking about how those outcomes are there and need to be focused on. So this actually is hard. I think we can see that as we look at these, that it takes a lot of emotional wherewithal and strength to really practice this in a good way. I am challenged by this all the time. I am challenged by how to do this in communities in ways that are healthy and healing and not just well-meaning. And I routinely fail, but they are also my North Star, if you will. So the third practice that I'm hoping we can think about together is creedal hopefulness. And that is a combination of words that I hope can be illustrated by just one story. So this is a picture of a community of one of the wonderful colleagues I have back from my seminary days, and we still get to luckily collaborate on things from time to time. But this is Friendship Presbyterian Church in Chicago. Now, some of you may know of Shauna Bowman and their art and creativity and justice ministry that they carry out, but may know less about their congregation in Chicago. So this is actually a long story about how this community is in this moment and moving forward. But the short version is that Friendship Presbyterian Church didn't exist 12 years ago. They were a discussion happening among 5 or 6 congregations on their part of the city, smaller, more traditional spaces, saying, how can we survive and grow together as communities? Let's dream something together. And eventually the idea was come up with as far as how can we sell our buildings and go in on something, let's go all in on something. And then there were 2. There were 2 churches who decided to truly trust, sell their buildings, and go all into community together, because they knew that that way they could really they could have funds and community to build something together. So they sold their buildings and they moved into a train station, and they called their pastor Shauna. And Shauna has been there for the last 10 years, and they are still, in quotation marks, without a church home, because their home is with each other. Their home is the community that they're building in this part of the city. And you can see the variety of folks who are around them. But it's not just about the physical or demographic diversity amongst them. It's about who they choose to welcome as well, who they choose to prioritize. And one thing I think that's important to recognize is that those 2 original seating congregations were actually made up of older folks. And many of them knew that they might not actually get to the point where they got to enjoy some brand new era where everything was settled again. And they knew that what they were buying into may not be something that was built to center them. And they chose it anyway. And now this community is on the verge of moving into a new space. They've gone all in once more and done a 15-year lease, as they have cooperated over the last 10 years to build affordable housing in the part of the city that they are in that is sorely needed, and tried to find a space that they can occupy in that same building to be a space of welcome and community. Now that sounds like a success story, but the way that Shauna tells it, she says they are always on the verge of failure. And I think that's really important to recognize, is that every time we really trust, we really live in hope, we always have to choose being on the verge of failure. And that means that people may not be willing to risk the next step. It means it may not work out. It means that the memory of this original congregation's sacrifice, this original congregation's choice, their hopeful choice to live into a new way of being community, may or may not be carried forward into the future in the way this community chooses to embody itself. But, and this is me talking now, this little church is betting everything on community. They're betting everything on love and on God's promises. And I think that's really powerful, because at the end of their 15-year lease, they might not be able to pay a pastor. They might not be able to be a church community in the way that we think about it, but they will have bet it all on something that really matters. And so I think that is what I mean by creedal hopefulness, to trade our certainty for the powerful possibilities that live in uncertainty, to lean all the way in to the promises of the gospel. And then when we let go and release our safety, we trust that God is going to step in and use us in ways that we have never imagined. So maybe the other way to talk about this is safety not guaranteed, but transformation certain. And when we think about it, that story is written all over the Bible. So just to review, this is quite a bit different than how we normally talk about hopefulness, right? Or ways that hopefulness can be talked about. Sometimes it can be talked about hoping for self-fulfillment or happiness or ease. I can fall into that all the time because ease is very nice, right? Happiness is good. There's nothing wrong with those things. Comfortable transactional beliefs. Again, this is things we can all fall into. I certainly have fallen into this many times. Praying in order to get good things, going to church so that I can feel like a good person or I can go to heaven. The belief that things will get better and better. The hope that this time of hard things will be over and things will return to being easeful. And someday there will be justice. That's often how we end up accidentally falling into, shall we say, habits of hopefulness that may not take us as far as we need to go. So here's my, way of thinking about the tensions in creedal hopefulness. It's not as much about personal comfort because it's about willing to die to live. And I think when we really dig all the way down into what that means, I think we all know what it means to sacrifice something about our comfort, to sacrifice something about our ease for something that is so much more valuable. So willing to die to live, willing to let something go in order to find new wholeness. It's not optimistic, but it's realistic. And yet, here's a lot of words, defiantly faithful to the gospel message of redemption and resurrection. So this isn't Pollyanna hopefulness. This isn't it'll be better tomorrow. This isn't someday things will be good. This is really being willing to look at the world and the harms that we are doing as it is, and defiantly faithful to what it's going to take to get us where we need to go. And finally, along with that, it's not just someday, but it's actively engaged in transformative work, both in my heart, in our hearts, and in the world. So, I think there's a lot that we could talk about with any of these, but I just want to highlight one or two ways that this can show up. I saw former PCUSA co-moderator Jan Edmiston's blog a few days ago, and she was talking about the fear and mistrust that can grip us so often these days. And she has a nice blog post about this, referencing The Thing, that classic film that has been remade for this era, because that's what we need these days, right? But she also offered some gospel practices that lean into a different way of being, that lean into trust, to interdependence, and to really true faithfulness. So just to highlight one or two of the things she talked about that I think are ways we can live this out, is she talked about non-transactional blessings. In other words, choosing to be a blessing in your community, choosing to be a blessing in the relationships that you have without an expectation that you're going to get thanked, without an expectation that you're going to get more members, and without an expectation that you're going to become more popular as a result. The other one she mentioned was organizations that exist to serve others rather than perpetuate their institution. And then she put in parentheses afterwards, hello, presbyteries and synods, which is great because I work for a presbytery. So it's important to recognize that we often do think about serving others so long as we can survive, helping others so long as I can continue. But recognizing that institutions are not people, it makes me wonder about what we choose to leave on the table in terms of the impact we could have when we think that institutions are like people. Institutions are made to grow for a season and serve a purpose and then find a new form. And so for her, that was one thing she wanted to hold up. Another one she said was being a safe place for everyone and not just the dominant demographic. And she put in parentheses, I'm looking at you, friendly churches, who aren't actually friendly to everyone. And then finally, working together for something life-giving beyond ourselves. So I thought that was a nice way of her sort of illustrating these themes. So I started all of this by talking about ships and the rough waters that we're in and so on, and then we went on to talk about a lot of other things that had nothing to do with seafaring ships. But really, that's just a foundational metaphor to think about how we are navigating these times and how we want to navigate them if we want to do more than just survive, personally or for our families. If we truly want to believe that social justice isn't just an optional thing that we do when we feel okay enough to engage in it, but that social justice and the lack of it is the reason we are living through the times we're living through. And if that's true, then how can we live through these times in a way that's intentional about making that change happen? So I hope that if there's one thing you take away from this, is that it's not that I am enough alone to persist and to do the work of justice in these times. I was hired into this position as the Anti-Racism Institutional Assessment Coordinator of the Presbytery of the Twin Cities area, and that's one person doing that job. But I've always thought that my role is as a facilitator for the work that congregations are already doing, for the work that the Presbytery as a co-op of those congregations is already doing. So my job isn't to do that work, it's to help us believe that our collective action is enough to get us to better, is enough to move us toward justice, if we believe that's true, if we truly buy in and bet it all. So I'm not enough alone, but we, all of us collectively together, are enough. And I don't just mean the people in this room, I mean the people outside these doors, in our communities, especially those who are the most socially marginalized. And so from every background, we need to come together around these issues. So there'll always be some that don't want to join in, that's true, but we look for those who want to dream these dreams, who want to do the seafaring work that we have to do. And so it's an invitation to let go of the panic or the fear or even the exhaustion that we feel, not because they aren't real, but to let go of them because they are not the food that will sustain us. So sometimes that can be all that's running through my head, is how tired I am, or how afraid I am that whatever it is that I'm working on won't work. But that will not feed me. What will feed me is looking toward the stars. What will feed me is trusting that I can navigate the waters. What will feed me is remembering that there are many other ships out on this ocean also seeking justice. So we lean into these gospel practices as we do that generational vision, that radically interdependent action. And when I say radically here, I mean rooted, right? Radically rooted interdependent action and creedal hopefulness. So with that, sometimes cultivating the future really does just start with things that are as simple as that. And when I say simple, I don't mean easy, of course. And so these three practices are ones that I have been trying to take into my spirit in the last couple months, and ones that I will continue to try to cultivate going forward. So as we sort of think about those things and think about all the ways that we are cultivating practices that don't just help us move through these times, but be transformed through them, I hope that this can be a continued part of the conversation. So with that, I have time for questions or other conversation that we want to have together. Opening the floor.
Thank you. I have a question, actually. It bubbled up like mid-talk for you. And I mean, I so appreciate what you're saying. I think we do need to change that paradigm shift from helping because it's what we're supposed to do versus helping and diving deeper and willing to have higher stakes. What messaging do you feel would be helpful in doing that so that people can think about changing their spiritual or personal paradigm?
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is that we can be personally convinced that this is important, but how do we communicate to others around that? And I think, first of all, we need to get better at testimony, right? As let's just say, as generally progressive folks, sometimes it can be very hard to think about what does testimony mean to me? But for me, testimony is about telling my soul truth even if it's not, the traditional forms that has been used. So what is your testimony? What is your witness? What is your story about how you have been changed and fed and transformed by going deeper? What are the ways that you've been freed up to move differently in the world by letting go of something? And so starting with those stories can be a really powerful piece. I think the second thing is recognizing that as we communicate these things, there's this delicate balance between, especially when talking to people who have privilege in the system or who have what they might feel like is a lot to lose, and that might be us, right? Maybe I'm talking to myself, right? But whenever we're talking to folks who have privilege in the system, being able to recognize that there's a balance between saying, hey, this will feed you. This will help you. This will change your fear of having enough. This will change your way of looking at yourself and the world. And saying, this isn't about you, right? Because fundamentally, we're not going to, sending the message that like this is a self-help program for people with privilege isn't going to get us where we want to go either. Leaning into that piece around interdependence is so important. So how do we start talking about the ways that we make choices for the more than human world, right? In other words, for the environment, in ways that really respect that that's a valuable way to think about things. So, it doesn't mean that whenever we communicate about these things that we're going to sound like, oh, that sounds great, thank you, let me join you in that journey, right? Because there's a lot to lose. Like I said, always being on the edge of failure is where the gospel lives. That's where Jesus spent his whole ministry, right? And that is the story of Holy Week, right? And that means that we also have to be willing to look foolish. So I don't know if that gets at everything you were wondering about, but I think those are three pieces: that balance, that willingness to testify, and the willingness to sound foolish, and to just lean into that. Because I think those are three ways that testimony can be really powerful in this area. So thanks.
Thanks.
Other questions or comments?
Good morning. I wonder if you could maybe share some examples from any of the three practices of where you've seen people exercising those practices, particularly in relation to acting now to further justice.
Yeah, so I think a couple of the ones that I highlighted around, the even the Dungeons and Dragons gaming group, right? The ways that they are helping young people carry that out into their communities, so that eventually Dungeons and Dragons turns into knowing how to make air purifiers and water purifiers for their communities. So there's very pragmatic ways like that. But I also think that radically, the generational vision piece, I think that showed up in the story around Friendship Presbyterian Church, being able to say, I choose something that will not be primarily for me. I choose something that will bring life in the future that might not serve me first, but that will serve people. So I think those are the kind of big level ways that we can choose that. I think the short-term ways that like I individually can choose those things. When I think about generational vision, I think about what's more important for me to get another gig, another certification, another this or that that's going to benefit me personally, or learning a skill that's going to benefit my community. So I mentioned at the beginning that one of my practices is permaculture gardening. That's one of my spiritual dedications. And the reason I lean into that is because that means food for communities. And I don't flatter myself that I'm going to feed the world or feed the community. What I believe is that neighborhoods are going to be our future, and the more that we can think of our neighborhoods in diverse ways, not just who are our literal neighbors, that will be powerful. So I think some of those little things are ways that we can lean into this. Interdependent action for me means collaboration. So when I try to come up with something, I'm always thinking about who can I collaborate with on this, not what brilliant idea is going to sprout from my head by myself. But like, who are the writers and thinkers I'm collaborating with, but also who are the humans that need to be speaking into this with me. And I think that creedal hopefulness thing, man, that is the tough one, right? How do we practice that on a daily and personal basis. But I do think that some of that comes down to how do I continue to make choices that are willing to risk something for the good, and not just my personal good, but for communal good. So for instance, a small way that we can do this is even just thinking about how do I alter my footprint in the world around me. Phil?
Yeah, sorry, I just came in late in between choir pieces, but um, your comment about collaboration, I think, really resounds pretty strong, and that is, I see an opportunity for building some long-term collaborations. This isn't something that's going to get done overnight, and I'd like you to comment about maybe some thoughts on ongoing collaboration, not just one-offs.
Oh, yeah. I think that's super powerful because who are we cultivating as partners and conversation partners and the way that people talk about it a lot is co-conspirators, right? So how can we choose to lean into ways of being in community that work on myself enough so that I can be a trustworthy collaborator, right? That I'm not going to be someone who is selfish or self-centered in my work, or who is only seeking what's going to benefit me, and who is truly listening to people who have experienced the most systemic impact of the society in the way we have it right now. And I think those partnerships grow through trust and time, like you said. So Shauna, one of my colleagues that I was mentioning, some of my friends and colleagues that I have known for 15 years now, those are the people I can turn to. And then people that they know are other collaborators that I can lean into as well. So relationships build more relationships. And I think if our world ran on relationships, we would have a very, very different world. So I think you're totally right, Phil. Yeah.
I'm not trying to relate, so I'm not following everything you're saying, but aren't the programs in the churches where they're trying to help people? Aren't the programs in the various churches that are trying to help people? They're not for me.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you're talking about. You're
Sure.
saying they're out there to help people. We're already doing that, aren't we? I guess I'm missing your point totally on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think it is confusing because we do love a program, don't we? Right? We do. And I think there have been many instances where programs have helped people. The problem is that we tend to institutionalize problems instead of creating those relationships. So if I have a program that's focused on, problem X and then problem Y over here and problem Z, the people who are working on those problems may never talk to each other. And on top of that, they may think, yeah. So I'm just describing what I see, and we can disagree, right? But I think that recognizing that when we just focus on programming as the way that we solve problems, I can get turned into the problem solver for someone else's who maybe not, they are not the problem, but they are just living in a problem. Instead of seeing that person as being an expert and a valuable expert on what's going on for them. And in fact, maybe the program itself may not always be serving in the way we think. So I hear you, and I think it's complex.
And I just want to share an example of what, as I am listening to Anna, what I think about is a few weeks ago, we had our friends here from the Envision community. And those are people with lived experience of homelessness who are leading a project to figure out what would it look like to create intentional community. That did not start in a congregation, but they have invited congregations to be a support of it. So what I am hearing is that you're just saying keep our eyes open for those kind of opportunities. And especially when you talked about centering and being led by the folks who are the most marginal, that's what we're all moving toward. And so I think you're right, George. We have some programs, and what we're trying to figure out is when we center those programs in equity and justice, they look different. So that's our opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Can we get some material that Friendship Presbyterian Church's history to read?
Yeah, I
see
think
some of the things they worked on?
sure. There are some articles out there, and actually, their story is super, I think, fascinating because a lot of their experience has also been grounded in the justice work that they've done in their community. And so there's whole bits of the story that I left out. So I will try to drop a link for that in whether it's these slides or somewhere else. Yeah. Any other comments or reflections? Well, I'll just share briefly that these are some of the other capacities that I am in dialogue with our churches in the Presbytery about as ways to cultivate how we can live into these things, right? Because these are big, big tasks, right? Creedal hopefulness, radically interdependent action, all those sorts of things. But how can we get started? My suggestion is that led by a lot of voices of color and anti-racist and justice leaders, these are some of the things that I think they spend a lot of time talking about as ways we can lean into this. So you can see here on this list, it says attention and curiosity. And by that, I mean attention to what's going on inside of me and curiosity about why it's there. Like why do I feel that way about this? Embodiment, compassionate imagination, right speed, which is about, I'm not going to be able to, do everything right now, but I can keep doing something every day. Having spiritual boundaries, respecting the spiritual boundaries of others. Conspiration, which is my made-up word way of talking about that idea of being able to conspire with one another. Resilience, humility, which is a huge one. And sometimes refraining, not doing something, letting something go, being able to take a breath, because that way, not acting on our first instinct can be a very powerful tool for justice, because sometimes we hurt relationships when we just react. So these are kind of like, and maybe this goes back to what you were saying, Joe, like these are kind of like the micro steps that lead into the macro pieces as well. So thank you all for your time and the conversation, and I hope that as you all move forward through this time, you can be thinking about how you want to cultivate and what you want to cultivate in your life for wholeness.
Thank you, Reverend Anna Kendig Flores, for sharing your insights and perspectives on this very important topic. We greatly appreciate you sharing these with us. For our next forum, we are working on a couple of different options, so please watch the church announcements through the webpage for further information as we finalize our plans for next week. Thank you very much.